Hi, my name is Mark Rickert, and I wrote The Tone Poet. The Tone Poet is primarily, it's about a guy who had a near-death experience, and he heard music. And it's a common phenomenon, this idea of people having a near-death experience and hearing some sort of ineffable music that really doesn't translate in the physical world, the material world. But many people have heard it, and the consensus usually is that you can't recall it when you come out of that experience. I think my character mirrored my own journey, and it's about a guy who has bigger questions and who is hurt in his life, and is on his own spiritual quest, and hopefully finds purpose in this quest, and that the quest takes him to some very dark places.
So where did you come up with the idea of writing a book about near-death experience music?
Yeah, I think the idea came to me over a pretty large span of time, and I wrote it over a large span of time. Additionally, I think I had the idea when I was 18 years old, and I was in literary class, literature 101, and it was Dante's Inferno. And coming out of the Inferno, at the top of this mountain, he could hear the music of the spheres. And so the idea of music of the spheres, I thought that was pretty cool. And the teacher elaborated on it a little bit, but I started looking into it. And so it began there, and then I discovered that the idea that there's something more beyond us. But even more interesting to me is this idea that from here you can look there. We found BQB Publishing. Actually, it was a friend of my wife worked with BQB. And BQB, the way I kind of perceive it, is sort of a smaller independent publishing house. I sent it to them, and knowing that they weren't really interested in publishing this kind of darker horror, fantasy type literature, I think a response I got back was holy balls. You know, I've been writing the book for 10 years, and honestly, I've been writing it alone. You know, I think Stephen King has an analogy of writing a book of a guy on a raft, and you've got to get across this vast ocean, and you can't see the other side, and you're all alone on this raft, and there's really no one out there that can help you get there. So writing a novel, as a first-time writer, it took me a long time to write a novel, to learn how to really move a story, to structure. I've always wanted to be a writer from the time I was a little kid, and I joined the Army Reserves for the most part so that I could learn to write better. So I became a photojournalist. A year later, 9/11 happened, and when I saw that on TV, aside from the horror that we all experienced while watching it, I also knew that I was going to be called up to go into combat. And I had already started writing the book about 3 months prior to getting the call that we're going, and this was in 2003. And when I got that call, it became something, since I'd already proclaimed to everybody that I'm starting a novel. Then I get this call, and I found out that I'm going to be in potentially Iraq, and it was Iraq, for an entire year. I thought, you know what, I'm going to get through this time by writing my first novel. It goes back to, I guess, my infatuation with the what if factor, or what happens when we die. I've always been intrigued with that darker question, and I liked horror movies from, I think when I was 6 years old. There was an awful Edgar Allan Poe movie. I wanted to do something with fantasy that could shock somebody. I had some trauma in my life when I was a kid, house burning down. I believe you can read that in the book a little bit about that experience, but I was 14, I think, at that time, and I quickly latched on to Stephen King. Stephen King was my absolute hero. I'd already read, I picked up It, I was 12 years old. I remember going to class, and I had this book that was so heavy, and it impressed all the kids. I remember thinking that kids are going to think I'm a nerd by coming to school with this book, but they were all very impressed that I was reading this gigantic book. And that book really scared me. But what I loved about it was more than just horror. And I think that book showed me what you can do with, writing about the more darker story. Because, with Stephen King and the authors that I read, Clive Barker, Stephen King, those guys, they tucked into that dark tale, there's something more. It teaches you about life, spirituality, overcoming adversity, whatever. And I think sometimes that horror is boxed into this idea that, Jason with a hockey mask. But that the genre can be bent in fascinating ways. I don't know what happened, but I began a kind of spiritual journey. I became very, introspective of myself, my growth as a person, my quest for God and spirituality. And I took that quest with me wherever I went, through Iraq, Paris, Germany, traveling alone, and even Peru, being alone. And I think that's the best way to seek, is to do it by yourself. Writing for me was never an option, and it was always a sort of promise. And talk about spiritual. I think that I've been promised this. Either it was by myself, me promising me, or that God promising me. But I've always just felt that if I stuck to it and I wrote and I tried my hardest, that it was just going to happen. And it was never really a question. And I remember being a kid and always just thinking, this is going to happen. And as it begins to happen, I don't even think it's going to be a surprise, because I'm ready for it to happen. So as far as limitations on that, I don't believe in limitations on my book. I think the author has great responsibility in what we're trying to convey to our readers, because you don't know who you're affecting and who you're teaching out there, and what kind of guiding light that you are providing to somebody out there. October, the book is going to be released to the public, and it's going to be a big day for me.